We're originally going to talk a little bit about, spend most of my time talking about a couple research projects and some collaboration we've been engaged with. When I say we, in this case, it's actually forest landowners, large forest landowners in the Southeast, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and some of the state agencies. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. But as I got pulling this together and got thinking about things, I thought there was maybe a need to kind of go back and talk a little bit about understanding how we might approach gopher tortoise management, in this case for gopher tortoises, on privately owned forests, working forests. And so I want to talk about that a little bit of context for everybody so we all on the same page starting. I want to talk about open pine conditions. That's been addressed a couple of times. I was glad to hear some folks talk about that it's about the pine structure, not necessarily about the pine species, with the understanding that longleaf provides a lot of advantages for being able to manage for gopher tortoises. Clearly, that's the case. And then talk a little bit about some collaboration that we have going on, a little bit of the research that I was going to talk about originally. And then I've got just some thoughts I think that may be useful for tomorrow. You all might actually run me out of town on the rails when you hear me what I'm going to say, but I'm going to try it anyway and see what happens. And if you see anything I don't like, it's because Dan Roach told me to tell you that. So let's just be clear about that. I'm just the spokesperson. So, and I think that what I want to do will fit in really well with kind of the base level of information we've tried to establish here today. So when we look at the Southeast, and this has been hit on several times, 80% of the Southeast is privately owned by a number of entities. You can see corporations, private individuals, and the like. And the largest threat to that is urbanization. And I think that's really important to keep in mind because as I drove down here, so I actually spent the night in Camden, Alabama last night at a deer hunting camp that I have up there and then drove down. I drove through a whole lot of cotton fields. And I do know that when you go from agriculture back to forest, that forest is never quite the way it's supposed to be. When that forest stays in forest cover, there will always be conservation opportunities, especially in the understory. There's been some really good work done. A guy named Craig Hedman did some work on that. So when you look at that agricultural threat, I'll call it a threat, land use, I should say, and you look at urbanization as a loss of forest cover, we have to concentrate on what can we do and what we have available, and what do we have to do to keep forest in forest. And one way to do that, obviously, is to get an economic return. Weyerhaeuser doesn't own land in the Southeast because we like to look at trees. It's because it makes the company money, which makes its shareholders money, which makes everybody happy. So within that context, how do we work in conservation? And when you look at it from large forest landowners working forests, there's about 39 million acres available. Now, of course, a lot of that is in different habitat types that perhaps gopher tortoises don't like. Soils are critically important, obviously. But this large area, we have to ask ourselves, what is the conservation value? And is there a conservation value there for that? So to get to that, we got to think a little bit about how this system works. And it takes a little bit of a thought exercise. So when you look at a working pine forest, we're talking about the actual part that's managed for pine production. Of course, there's always parts in there that aren't being managed that way. Starts with a clear-cut harvest, it's even age management. Stand establishment is some sort of site preparation, usually mechanical and chemical, or just chemical, depending on what's there. That chemical herbicide or that chemical treatment during site prep can be really valuable if you're trying to get rid of waxy leaves and hardwood species. I've seen a lot of slides in here with a lot of hardwoods in it, and we can't discount the ability of herbicides to get us where we want to go as a base to start this process. Stand establishment, trees are planted either by hand or by machine planting. A lot of times in these, it just depends on the soil type and some of the different things about which approach you want to do. There'll be some sort, the site preparation the same way on the drier, sandier sites we're talking about. A lot of times the site preparation is fairly minimal because the soil is already very loose and available for a pine tree to get started. Don't have a lot of water to worry about because it's well drained. Stand establishment oftentimes will include some sort of a herbicide treatment the first year after the trees are planted to provide them a chance to jump up a little bit and get ahead of the competition. Very temporary effects. And then really when I think that we have the most opportunity in these forests for things like gopher tortoises after those stands are thinned. Because once the stands are thinned, then you can manage that basal area and manage those canopy conditions for the rest of the rotation. And really for if you're in a saw timber production, that post-thin is probably the time your stand is going to spend the most time in that stage. And then of course you have a final harvest and it starts all over again. So what we have to recognize is you're not going to have a situation in these managed forests. We're going to manage that stand for gopher tortoises for 60 years. Okay, you're talking about 25 to a 30-year rotation. But what is happening if you have a large block of ownership is there are appropriate habitat conditions because of active management occurring across that landscape all the time. So I mentioned the research. I just wanted to talk about a few in particular, multiple partners there that we're working with. So one of them is Gopher Tortoise Conservation on Managed Forest Landscapes. This is on 2 sites. This is with Mississippi State University with a graduate student with Scott Rush, who's at Mississippi State. We have a site in Mississippi we've been managing for gopher tortoises with the Fish and Wildlife Service for a number of years. Ben's Creek is one of the largest populations in Louisiana on private land. It's a really unusual site though because it's not what I would call a great gopher tortoise soil, and it's a very high water table. So it provides some very interesting things. When they're laying their eggs and their eggs are getting wet, it makes you kind of wonder what's going on. So we're trying to figure that out a little bit. When you put a burrow scope in, you hear the tortoises splashing in the bottom of the burrow. I mean, literally. So working with, you all probably know Carrie Landry, we're working with her on that site. So our first field season for that was in 2017. I mentioned the Understanding Gopher Tortoise Ecology on Managed Forests. This is the literature review with the University of Georgia. And so that review's completed and they're starting to try to publish some of that information. So again, we start with that base of where are we and where do we need to go. The last one is the Gopher Tortoise Population Dynamics on Working Forest. And this is the follow-up project to that literature review I talked about, looking at gopher tortoise habitat conditions, including the value of permanent openings, which we've talked about. Understand the shifting mosaic. So the idea here is that we're going to find some areas that have enough gopher tortoises to study and that are also due to have some sort of silvicultural habitat management activities on them. Mark tortoises and see how they respond to that. Do they go, how long does it take them to find those areas that are of benefit to them and start using them again? We're kind of doing that at Sandpit as well. We've marked some tortoises, radio marked them, and we're planning to do some more habitat improvement on that area. And so we'll be able to watch how those tortoises respond to that as well. Because I think that's one of the big questions. We know that those conditions occur on these private landscapes, but how well do the gopher tortoises use that and able to respond to that? I think that's the real question. And then, of course, I mentioned the proposals developed. Nikazi is a key partner. They're providing most of the funding for this work. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, is providing some. And I think because it's University of Georgia, this work's probably going to take place in Georgia. We're working on trying to use that survey information that they have to find the right places to do this work. So it'll be some variable folks, some variable places. So this is that Sandpit site I mentioned in the listed portion of the range in Perry County, Mississippi. And I just want to provide this as an idea of the potential of some of the things that can happen. This site actually has some longleaf on it, but a lot of it's thin loblolly. So last year was the first field season that Dustin, the graduate student, who is an Auburn graduate, and I have to give him credit for that, I guess, is working on this project. So last year he took 144 burrows, including 19 juvenile burrows, which is really exciting to actually see that many juvenile burrows. And then also he captured 5 juveniles as well out on the landscape. So at least those guys are made it long enough to get big enough to see them, which is pretty nice. We've got 7 tortoises radio tagged right now, probably going to tag some more next year. And again, we're monitoring movements and we're going to do some associated habitat management. This is a little bit of a unique site, and so we're also working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to come up with a habitat management plan moving forward to make sure that we can take care of what they need on this area. So that's not a gopher tortoise. So I showed this for 2 reasons. One, to brag a little bit. My wife and I celebrated our 25th anniversary this year, and we went to Africa for a few days. And so this is we saw hundreds, if not thousands, of elephants. And this is one of my best elephant pictures in Botswana. So it's just good lighting. It's a good picture. But it also lets us talk about the elephant in the room. Okay, you all saw that coming. It must be too late in the day. Nobody laughed. All right. And a little bit of my thunder was stolen because this has been addressed a little bit today, but I think it's something we really need to think about. And that elephant in the room is prescribed fire. I've been to a lot of these type meetings with pine systems. It's always about burning. Burning is an ideal tool for managing these systems for a lot of species. It's what was maintained historically. It's what they've evolved with. The ecology, there's a whole ecological thing that happens with prescribed fire. But we don't ever talk about what it's going to look like in the future on the landscape. And we need to have that conversation. What is the future of burning in the southeastern U.S.? My buddy Dan Roach tells me every time we talk about this, there's 22 million people in the state of Florida. How many more a day? 1,000, 5,000, 10,000?
1,000 a day, there's 10 million attorneys.
Yeah, 22 million people and 10 million attorneys, okay? When you look at the infrastructure that's taken place because of the number one threat to forest, urbanization, and the ability to use prescribed fire is not going to get better, it's going to get worse. As a large landowner, I understand there's liability laws in place to protect prescribed fire. If Weyerhaeuser does a burn and somebody has a wreck, it doesn't matter how many laws are in place, we're going to get sued. It's going to cost us money. And so what's the risk of that? What's the reward of that? How do we approach that? How do you continue to use burning on a large scale when you have restricted burning days? Somebody earlier talked about doing prescribed burning in the warm, dormant versus growing season to extend that window. In some cases, you can have a really good burning program, but you may not have the days to be able to do it, or the infrastructure, or the people to do it. We've got an area in Louisiana where we're managing for red-cockaded woodpeckers. We have a safe harbor agreement. We have 42 breeding pairs or something. And it's a challenge to burn that area the way we need to, and it gets away from you. So my question is what are our desired standing conditions? Our desired standing conditions are an open overstory with a diverse herbaceous understory and no midstory. Are there alternative ways to get there? Do we need to think about that when we think about gopher tortoise conservation or open pine conservation across a broad landscape? And so, and all those things, we run the gamut of it. If you go and look at pine silviculture, it runs the gamut of all that depending on the situation. Something else that's important is silviculture has changed over the past 10 to 15 years. It has gone to large, and I'm not going to, again, you can't say it's everywhere because every place is different, but it's definitely gone to, and these guys can shake their head up and down if they disagree, gone to planting fewer trees per acre, having more opportunity to manage for open conditions through heavier thinning regimes. You got more of a saw timber type market and that kind of thing. And so in a lot of places, the silviculture is not what it was where you're planting 1,000 trees per acre and you're carrying those 1,000 trees till they're 12 or 15 years old, then thin into 300, it's not the same system. And so it's really important to understand how that's changed, and will probably continue to change as markets change and those opportunities for selling that product are differ. So recently we completed a study with some folks, and the citation is there at the bottom. It was just published in Forest Ecology. Did I say citation? Boy, I've been in Mississippi too long. A citation, papers from 2016 with some folks from Mississippi State and the Kazi and myself. And the question is what do we know from the literature about species response to some of these methods in managed pine forests, things like thinning treatments and site preparation and that. So this meta-analysis looked at 42 publications from 14 different studies that looked at over 1,500 effects of biodiversity from these management actions. These were in most cases really well replicated field studies with discrete treatments being tracked over a long period of time. The study I mentioned earlier was one of the studies that was used here. So what we found out was that open pine species responded positively to chemical stand establishment versus mechanical. So again, we talk about the chemical use to control those hardwood species and things like that. It appears that the chemical versus the mechanical treatment seem to be more positive for open species during that early part of the rotation. A positive effect was seen on thinning for reptiles and small mammal species. Again, you're reducing the pine density and you're letting that sunlight hit the ground, which is the goal here. A little bit surprised we didn't have a stronger bird effect, but I think that would be stronger if you looked at treatments that's done after the stand was thinned. And then there's a variable response to species to fire and herbicide treatments after thinning. And that basically is species specific, right? Some species like that fire and herbicide treatment, some species don't. If you're a northern bobwhite or a prairie warbler, you love it. If you're a northern cardinal, you don't like it so much. Okay, so we all know how that works. So that was pretty interesting to have a study that kind of looked at all that together to talk about the positive benefits of open pine within the managed system. That's actually a plantation. I think that one's in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. So something else we talked about, I already alluded to a little bit, was the idea of these short rotations providing shifting mosaic across the landscape. And we actually have looked at this in a paper that's in review right now. So when you look at, this is an actual pine landscape. This is actually some of our ownership in Mississippi. Don't mind the square blocks. Those are another study that's going on looking at hardwood control and young plantations. But this is a typical forest landscape. You can see the blocks of the different ages and types of forest stands that are on that area. So this paper, the citation is there. That's it again, the citation is there. is still in review. It's been through one round, and we're working with the reviewers right now. So what we did is we looked at we got data from 2 actual large landscapes that are intensively managed for pine, working forest landscapes that are under typical management, and we followed those for a 90-year time period through this simulation model called HAB plan. And so we looked at the time from canopy closure, so trees are planted, trees close up, and then you thin it. So we looked at the time between canopy closure to final harvest during that mid-rotation period the trees were thinned, okay? And what we found out was if you plant less than 530 trees per acre, there's up to 4 years of excellent open pine conditions following thinning. And again, this excellent was defined based on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service table that it didn't provide here that shows basal area, herbaceous ground cover, and then excellent, I think it's excellent, good, fair, poor, or unsuitable, or something like that. And it was dependent on site index. The interesting thing about site index is gopher tortoises tend to like soils that are a little bit less site index because they're real sandy, deep soils. And what you do management-wise tends to last a little longer than a better quality soil where stuff recovers a lot more quickly. Part of the study looked at, okay, what if we sprayed it and burned it after we thinned it? Then it seemed to indicate through this modeling exercise that you would get maybe 4 more years of excellent conditions. So you're talking about maybe 8 years of excellent conditions after thinning if you do these things in a commercially managed plantation. And it also looked at spatial and temporal connectivity. I talked earlier about how these appropriate stand conditions pop up in the landscape over time because of active management. The modeling exercise seemed to indicate that there was some connectivity there that seemed to be positive. But the question that I'm sure that you all are asking is, can gopher tortoises actually use these landscapes? Can they respond to this management? We've heard about they're on the edge of the food plot, can they go back in the forest, and when do they go back in there? But maybe we can create habitat conditions that are conducive to these species that not as good as if you burned it, but are sufficient to support those populations. And maybe we need to think more about that and have those discussions, and I think we need more research effort. We can talk about burning and how great it is, and we know that, and research and say, yes, burning is really good. But I'll get back to the slide that was shown a minute ago about the hardwood encroachment with every 3 years burn. All you need is a good imazapyr application, and guess what? That problem goes away for a very long time if you keep burning it once you do that. Because those rootstocks are dead, and those trees are out of there. I wish I had a picture I was going to show. We did a single spray and did a burn in 6 or 7 years. It was still really good, but I think it's because I had a high pine canopy and it kept sunlight down enough that it kept the hardwoods from resprouting, but yet there's a good herbaceous. Anyway, I get off on a tangent there. So I know this is an uncomfortable conversation, but I think it's one we have to have. If we're really going to manage to conserve these species in the 21st century landscape in the Southeast, we have to think about alternatives to prescribed fire and understand how that fits within this whole idea of conservation for these species across the landscape. It's been thinned, it opens back up again. That stands open for a while, maybe it's not managed, and maybe after 4 or 5 years it gets that hardwood encroachment, but then the stand next to it has been thinned. And so those appropriate habitat conditions for things like gopher tortoises and open pine species are ephemeral within that stand, but they can occur across the landscape. Now, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but I think that's important because it's hard sometimes to think about that shifting mosaic of habitat conditions and what that means for the conservation opportunities for those species that need that. I also want to mention that all the large landowners that I'm aware of and a lot of other landowners are certified in some way for certification, whether it's SFI, FSC, American Tree Farmers has one. That's a third-party audit system that says that Weyerhaeuser, for example, is SFI certified. We're going to do these certain things. An auditor comes in and says, yes, you are doing those things, or no, you aren't doing those things. And so it provides us with an extra obligation to do some things. Within SFI, for example, there's goals for habitat diversity, conservation of G1, G2 species, and also for T&E species conservation. The loggers that we use are SFI certified or trained. And so we have a mechanism in place to get those conservation messages out to the folks that are on the ground. So if we have a logger that's working where there's gopher tortoises, we can talk about what we're worried about and how they need to be careful and manage around that species, for example. So there's a whole system in place that I think really helps with that. Another thing is best management practices in the Southeast are voluntary. But if you're certified, they're required. So all these acres where BMPs are in place are required if you're certified. So that gives some assurances that those practices are going to be in place and on the ground. So let's go back to open pine forest. Again, we know the story, right? Historically, fire maintained, keep those nasty hardwoods out of the mid-story and make the nice stuff on the ground so all the little critters can have plenty to eat. So we all understand that pretty well. And what's important is, again, the structure. An open overstory, herbaceous understory, little mid-story if at all possible. This slide is a 30-year-old loblolite pine plantation in Mississippi that was managed with a single herbicide treatment and then a fire every 3 years. And this is actually in the flatwoods, very productive soil. Stuff grows really quickly in the flatwoods. You close your eyes and blink and it's something different. So just the point that, you know, even a plantation that's carrying a lot more basal air than you would typically think of as open can be managed in a way that provides these open conditions. This thing was actually part of an 11-year study with Mississippi State looking at bird communities in these open pine conditions, some pretty interesting results. So again, the question is we have these open pine structures, you know, can these managed forests provide that structure? And we've done a lot of research in the South on these plantations. Weyerhaeuser's had a research program since the early 1970s. And the research that we've developed and looked at clearly indicates that managed pine landscapes can provide open pine conditions during at least portions of the rotations. And you can't get any more specific than that because the silviculture is so varied. Even with a single company like Weyerhaeuser, what we do in certain places is different. It's based on what markets are there. It's based on past stand history. It's based on site conditions, soil types. All of these things go into consideration when you're managing a stand. And things like how many trees did you plant, what's your planting density, and what are you thinning to after you're thinning. All of that goes into the quality of that particular stand, how long that stand may be in an open pine condition. The other thing that's important to remember, and of course I should also mention what silvicultural treatments are being applied during the rotation. Or is there a herbicide to control hardwood? We have some collaboration I wanted to mention, and really the goal here is to determine the ability of private managed forests to provide gopher tortoise conservation value as part of the listing decision. We started the conversation today about precluding listing. We're very much into wanting to do that as well, as you can only imagine. Weyerhaeuser alone has over 1 million acres that overlaps gopher tortoise habitat in the unlisted portion of the range. So we're really interested in this and trying to see what's going to happen here. And so there's some collaborative opportunities going on that we're taking part of. This is actually a graduate student at Mississippi State looking at a burrow on a site I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So for state agencies, there was a mention of the gopher tortoise burrow surveys in Georgia, and some of that's been, we've collaborated with that as other private landowners. Working right now, there's some concern about yellow spot disease in Mississippi that we're looking at maybe trying to address a little bit. Some cooperative habitat management, we'll talk about here in a minute, and then networking, things like this, just talking to folks and understanding where the commonalities are, meeting the people that are doing things and understanding where our opportunities are. You know, the state of Louisiana received a grant to do some gopher tortoise improvement work through that stewardship program that was mentioned earlier. We did some herbicide work a few years earlier. It looks like we're going to follow up and do some prescribed fire on a site in Louisiana. We also have a pilot project, I don't know how it got called the pilot project, but it is, with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the primary contact there is a guy named Mike Harris in Georgia. I don't know if y'all know Mike or not. Mike's a great guy. And the idea here is let's work with the service through this listing decision process and let's really look at where we are with gopher tortoise conservation on the landscape as part of this listing decision. And part of the goal here is to have a common understanding of conservation opportunities. Fish and Wildlife Service understands what we're trying to do as working forest owners, and then us trying to understand what Fish and Wildlife Service is doing. I'm actually co-chairing this pilot project with Mike Harris, and it's not because I'm an expert, because I'm not. It's because there are two people left the South, and I was the next person on the list. So it's been a great learning opportunity, actually. One thing we're working on right now, and in fact I've got a draft that's getting ready to go back to Mike, is he suggested let's develop some gopher tortoise best management practices for private landowners. Let's provide some information of things people can do to help gopher tortoises so we can have something that the Fish and Wildlife Service says, yeah, this is really good. And if landowners apply it, then we can add that as conservation value during the listing decision. So we're pretty close on that, actually. Mike took a earlier draft. Dan helped me on this. Jimmy Bullock, who's not here, also with RMS helped out. And we provide the service. They provide some comments, and we're still massaging it. The other thing is a research project development. you know, right now we did a literature review that University of Georgia did to look at what we know about gopher tortoises on working forest, a literature review, kind of looking for information gaps. We're going to use that document to develop a research project to look more extensively or intensively at gopher tortoise response to forest management. And so that's actually, I think the first field season for that research for the field part will probably be next year. We're still kind of floating the proposal, but the proposal was developed not only with University of Georgia, with McCasey, and with ourselves, but also with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So, you know, they have buy-in, which is really important. And then I mentioned that there in the last bullet. So something else I think is important to mention is the National Alliance of Forest Owners. Okay, thank you. I didn't look up NAFO. It could be the. No, don't get me started on that. We'll be here. Maybe tonight after a couple of beers we can write down NAFO and do some parking lot stuff with them. So NAFO has a species at risk program with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The website's up there. And basically this idea is to bring together all the elements for conservation of at-risk and declining species by engaging private forest landowners with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at a very broad scale. The underlying premise of this effort is that private forest landowners are critical to conservation success. We've talked about that. That science will guide us. We have to have the information in place to make informed decisions. That active forest management is a conservation tool. When you can actually go out there and manipulate the forest, you have an ability to contribute to conservation. And then also providing young forest stands, open canopy, and repairing aquatic conservation is something that's important that we can provide. I'm sure you all are familiar with the 400 and something species that have been petitioned of aquatic species. You know, we're working through all that with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of you probably understand that one of the fastest declining groups of songbirds, for example, in the eastern U.S. are those that depend on young forests. And so how can we contribute to that conservation of those species, in addition to some of these other at-risk species? So that's that NAFO concept, and it kind of is almost an umbrella to all the other activities that can plug into that.